None of us live in a vacuum. None of us are just floating along the journey of life unaffected by the forces around us. In our last video, we learned together that the world seeks to form us into a depressed, stressed, anxious, selfish consumer. But that the gentle whisper of Jesus seeks to form us into a person of love, grace, forgiveness, and service. We learned that the shouts and promises of culture aren't working out very well. All it takes is to look around and see the death, destruction, and division that permeates every news story, every social media scroll, every election cycle. I hope you'll take the time to go back and watch our last video, because right now we're going to dive into the next chapter of Daniel's life. We already learned that Daniel and his friends, they resolved not to defile themselves with the Babylonian culture. We learned that Daniel and his friends, they were resiliently faithful even in the face of cultural coercion. They decided that life God's way is the best possible life, no matter what culture has to offer. Let's jump forward and look at a new chapter in Daniel's life. This part of the story comes years and years after what we read in the last video. The old king Nebuchadnezzar is dead, and his son Belshazzar is ruling Babylon. One night, King Belshazzar decides to throw a huge party and get drunk with his friends. While they're drinking, the king decides that he wants to drink from the gold and silver cups his father brought back from the temple in Jerusalem. So Belshazzar and his friends, they take out the relics they stole from God's temple in Jerusalem, and then while they're drinking, they decide to get some worship in. And so they bring out their idols of gold and silver and bronze. While the whole party is drunk and worshiping these idols, suddenly, a hand appears and writes in huge letters on the wall. The author of Daniel tells us that the hand suddenly appearing was so frightening that the king's face turned pale, and he was so frightened that his knees knocked together and his legs gave way. The king, he does the only reasonable thing. He summons all of his magicians, all of his sorcerers and wise men to come and explain to him what the heck just happened. But there's a small problem. Everyone else is just as terrified as the king, and they can't explain anything. Then something interesting happens. Read it with me in verse 10. The queen, hearing the voices of the king and his nobles, came into the banquet hall. "May the king live forever," she said. "Do not be alarmed. Don't look pale. There's a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods inside him. In the time of your father, he was found to have insight and intelligence and wisdom like that of the gods. Your father, King Nebuchadnezzar, appointed him chief of the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. He did this because Daniel, whom the king called Belteshazzar, was found to have a keen mind and knowledge and understanding, and also the ability to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve difficult problems. Call for Daniel, and he will tell you what the writing means." Now remember, this is years after the events we read in chapter 1, but I think it illustrates an important point. Because Daniel was resiliently faithful to God's way of life, even in the face of Babylon's cultural coercion, he had a reputation of insight, wisdom, and intelligence. Not only that, he was known for having the spirit of the holy gods in him. The Babylonians didn't know or worship the one true God like Daniel, but because of Daniel's resilient faithfulness to God's way of life, all the people around him knew he was someone different. And the same thing can be true for you and for me today. When we resolve ourselves, when we're resiliently faithful to God's way of life, we can't help but stand out, because the love, grace, and forgiveness of Jesus is radically different than the division, selfishness, and hate in our world. The story continues. The king calls Daniel in and tells Daniel if he can explain the meaning of the hand and the writing on the wall, then he'll promote Daniel to the third highest ruler in the kingdom. Now let's pause here for just a second. This isn't a Disney movie. This isn't some magical moment where it's guaranteed that the good guy is going to make the right decision and everything is going to turn out okay. This is real life. Daniel's being offered a position as the third most powerful person in the entire world. And I can only imagine that he must have felt much the same way you or I would feel if we were offered the same opportunity. I imagine Daniel standing before the king, hearing the offer, considering it for a moment, taking a deep breath, and resolving himself once again to choose God's way of life over the life of Babylon. The story continues in verse 17, and Daniel reminds the king that his father, Nebuchadnezzar, was a great and mighty king, but that he was ultimately humbled by God, and in the end, even worshiped the one true God. Listen to what Daniel says to the king starting in verse 22. But you, Belshazzar, his son, have not humbled yourself, though you knew all of these things. Instead, you've set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You had the goblets from his temple brought to you, and you and your nobles, your wives and your concubines drank wine from them. You praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. They can't understand or see or hear. But you did not honor the God who holds in his hand your life and all your ways. Therefore, he sent the hand that wrote the inscription. This is the inscription that was written, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin. And here's what these words mean. Mene, God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Then, at Belshazzar's command, Daniel was clothed in purple, a gold chain was placed around his neck, and he was proclaimed the third highest ruler in the kingdom. That very night, Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain. Why do we read this story? Why are we looking at the life of Daniel? Well, remember, our goal is to develop Jesus followers who are resiliently faithful in the face of cultural coercion and who live a vibrant life in the Spirit. Now, I know it's unlikely any of us will ever stand before a king, president, or world ruler. It's unlikely we'll ever be called upon to speak truth to power the way that Daniel did. It's unlikely that you or I will ever be offered a position as the third most powerful person in the kingdom. But what is likely? What's guaranteed even is that every single day, every single moment, you and I have a choice. Are we going to be resiliently faithful to God's way of life, or are we going to give in? Are we going to compromise? Are we going to become someone who chases after the things the world has to offer? Or are we going to become someone like Daniel, who resolves themselves, who is resiliently faithful, and who ultimately never gives in to the lies of the world? In our next video, we'll read the famous story of Daniel and the lion's den. And we're going to discover not just that Daniel was resiliently faithful, but that he lived a vibrant life in the Spirit. Because God doesn't want us to have to tough our way through life. He doesn't want us to have to struggle through each moment. Rather, he wants you and he wants me to live a vibrant life in the Spirit. He doesn't want us to struggle. He doesn't want us to tough it through life. He promises that when we're committed to him, we can live a vibrant life.